is now my great pleasure to introduce our honoree. All of us are so pleased that he could be with us today. Andrew Solomon is a National Book Award-winning author whose latest book, Far from the Tree, shares the stories of families raising exceptional children. It has received all sorts of well-deserved accolades and honors, including the National Book Critics Circle Award. In addition to being a brilliant author, Andrew is also a dear friend of Columbia University Medical Center and Columbia Psychiatry, as he dedicates his time and efforts as a board member of both organizations. And also, I do want to say that I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to look at Far from the Tree, but it is a seminal work. It is really an extraordinary piece of scholarship, in addition to a wonderful book to be able to pick up at Barnes & Noble. And it's very engrossing, and it's the story of families that are raising children who fell far from the tree, who are unlike their parents for different kinds of reasons. And I presume that Andrew's going to tell you about this. But the families that are raising children that have dwarfism, that have become criminals, that are the children of rape, just very, very complex kinds of parenting challenges. And what I loved was that he was recently quoted in one of the newspapers as saying that when he became friends, and he truly became friends with these families, they really totally gave him access so that he could really find out what their lives was like. He said that you might have expected some of these families to be bitter, but he said for the most part, they ended up grateful for experiences that they would have done anything to avoid. So I'm very, very interested, as are you, I'm sure, to hear what he has to say. We salute his remarkable work and would like to present him with a small memento of our gratitude and welcome him to the stage. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Solomon.
Blue box. How exciting. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, exactly. Well, first of all, I'd like to say what a huge honor it is to be at this particular event. Jeff has become a great friend, but I admire his work enormously. He has helped to refer doctors for any number of friends of mine who have been going through difficult times in various places all over this country and all over the world. I've had a chance to witness the extraordinary burgeoning of research at Columbia, and I feel deeply, deeply lucky and privileged to count Jeff as a friend. And I think this event in raising funds also raises consciousness and also helps to reduce the feeling of stigma that blocks so many people from gaining access to the care that they deserve. So I'd just like to say that in tribute to Jeff Lieberman. And also I'd like to say a word in praise of the committee, whom I thank, and especially of my sister-in-law, Sarah Long Solomon, who's been very much involved in this process. Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no glamorization, no rationalization, no sophistry about simple differences in taste, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. That's Time magazine in 1966, when I was 3 years old. And last year, the President of the United States came out in support of gay marriage. And I was left to wonder how we got here from there. I was left to wonder how an illness became an identity and what the meaning of that shift and change might be. When I was about 6 years old, I went with my mother and my brother to a shoe store, Indian Walk Shoes on Madison Avenue. Some of you may remember it. And when we got finished getting our shoes, the salesman said that each of us could have a balloon. And my brother wanted a red balloon, and I wanted a pink balloon. And my mother suggested that I might actually prefer a blue balloon. And I said, no, I really wanted the pink balloon. And she reminded me that blue was my favorite color. The fact that blue now is my favorite color, but I'm still gay, is evidence, I think, of both my mother's influence and its limits. When I was growing up, she used to say from time to time, the love you have for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it's like. And when I was little, I took that as the greatest possible compliment. It meant that raising my brother and me was her great joy. And when I was an adolescent, I thought, but I'm gay and I may not ever be able to have children. And she went on saying it, and it made me anxious. And when I finally came out of the closet and she said it, it made me furious. I said, that's not the path I'm on, that's not what I'm doing, and I want you to stop saying that. About 20 years ago, my editors at the New York Times Magazine asked me to write a piece about deaf culture. And I was rather taken aback at the time because I didn't know that deafness was a culture. I thought it was a disability, pure and simple. Those people who couldn't hear, what a shame for them. And then I went out into the deaf world. I went to deaf clubs. I went to see deaf theater. I saw performances of deaf poetry. I even went to the Miss Deaf America contest in Nashville, Tennessee, where people complained about that blurry Southern signing. And the conclusion that I came to was that deafness is a culture. It's not my culture, and though I found it very attractive, I didn't want to give up the identities I have in favor of that one, but it has just as much a claim to being a culture as Latino culture, or Jewish culture, or perhaps even American culture. And then I discovered that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, and that those children often discover the deaf culture only in adolescence, after a childhood in which they've been pressed to function in the hearing world, and that it can come as a great liberation for them when they finally stumble into it. And I thought how similar it was to the gay experience when gay children are born to straight parents, and those straight parents often want to make them function in what they see as the mainstream and real world. And eventually, the children discover what it is to be gay from a community around them. And then a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf, and she began talking about all of the questions she faced. Should she tell her daughter she was just like everyone else but rather short? Or should she tell her daughter that she should become involved with the little people of America and somehow be constructing a dwarf identity? And as she narrated her bafflement, I thought this is a pattern that I'm encountering of families who perceive themselves to be essentially normal, who have children who are in some profound way different. And I ultimately came up with the idea that there are two kinds of identity. There are vertical identities that are passed down generationally, parent to child to the next generation, your ethnicity, your nationality in most cases, your language almost always, your religion frequently. These are all things that parents have in common with their children. And while there are vertical identities which are very difficult, nobody has attempted to cure them and make them go away. You could argue that in America, as it's currently constructed, it's harder to be a person of color than to be white. But nobody is trying to find technology that will allow the next generation of children born to African American or Asian parents to come out with creamy skin and blonde hair. The other kind of identity is a horizontal identity. It's something that one discovers from one's peer group, like deafness, like dwarfism, like gayness. I went on to investigate many of these categories as I wrote the book. And those are identities you do not have in common with your parents. And the tradition, time out of mind, has been to try to cure or resolve those identities. A lot of the people I met who had horizontal identities had very difficult relationships with parents who they felt had not been loving when they encountered the quality that those children had. And I, over time, came to think that there are two operative forces between a parent and a child. One is love, and the other is acceptance. And sometimes the deficit in acceptance feels like a deficit in love, but that isn't what it is. I was angry that my parents didn't instantly jump on board with every aspect of my being gay, but there's no question that they loved me the whole time. There's no question There's no question that all it was acceptance, and that acceptance takes time. Acceptance almost always takes time in dealing with these identities. In order to have a real sense of any identity being accepted as an identity, it needs to function at three levels. There needs to be self-acceptance, there needs to be family acceptance, and there needs to be social acceptance. And for me, the social acceptance is often a function of what the families do. The self-acceptance is related to what families do. And so I made families my area of inquiry. I'll tell you about one of the dwarfs I got to know. His name is Clinton Brown. And he was born with diastrophic dwarfism, which is a terribly disabling condition. And the doctors at the hospital said to his mother that he was never going to learn to walk or talk, would never recognize them, and should be left at the hospital to die quietly. And she said, no, I'm going to take my child home. She didn't have huge resources, either educational or financial. She worked in a call center, but she managed to find her way to Johns Hopkins, where the doctor who did the best treatment for that condition was then based. And in the course of his childhood, Clinton had 30 surgeries, major surgeries, as a result of which he is in fact able to walk. And while he was having all of these surgeries and was stuck in the hospital for long periods of time, he decided, as he had nothing else to do, that he would focus on his schoolwork. And so he focused on it, and he excelled, and he graduated high school with honors, and he was the first person in his family to go to college. And he went to college not far from where his parents live on Long Island, and he lived on campus, and he drove a specially fitted car that accommodated his diminutive size. And his mother told me that one day she was driving home and she saw the car, the very recognizable car, in the parking lot of a bar. And she said, I thought to myself, what is going on here? 2 beers, they're 6 feet tall, he's 3 feet tall. 2 beers for them is 4 beers for him. She said, I knew I couldn't just walk in there and tell him to leave, but I went home and I left him 8 messages on his cell phone. She said, and then I thought, if someone had told me when he was born that my future worry would be that he'd go out drinking and driving with his college buddies, I'd have been so glad to have that problem. And I asked her what she had done that had allowed Clinton to emerge as a charming, delightful, accomplished person. And she said, what did I do? I loved him, that's all. Clinton just always had that light in him. And I was lucky enough to be the first to see it there. I'm going to quote you from one other magazine. This is the Atlantic Monthly in 1969. There is no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome child away, whether it is put away in the sense of hidden in a sanatorium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person. There's been a lot of news about our changing attitude toward gayness. Indeed, it's on the front page of the paper almost every day that we've made a huge shift there. We forget how much of a shift there's been in the world of disability and how much valiant work disabled people have done to bring about that shift. One of the families I interviewed, Tom and Karen Robards, had a son with Down syndrome. They were shocked when it happened. They were hard-charging Wall Street types, busy, accomplished, and young. They had no reason to expect anything would be wrong. And after their son was born, they started looking at the educational possibilities for him, and they thought that everything seemed very disappointing. So they helped to found, in 2 small classrooms, something called the Cook Center with some other parents to provide better educational opportunities. And over the years, the Cook Center grew, and it's now educated untold thousands of children with intellectual disabilities of every kind. And I said to them, this has been your life's work. I said, do you regret it? Do you wish your son didn't have Down syndrome? Would you like to make it go away? And his father said, well, for David, our son, I regret it. And for David, our son, I would make it go away because it's made his life difficult, and I'd like to give him an easier life. But I think it would be a loss to all of us if it were to disappear. And his mother said, I'm with Tom. She said, if I could make it go away, I would do so for my son. But speaking for myself, well, I would never have believed 23 years ago when he was born that I could come to such a point. It's given us so much richer a life. It's made me so much better a person than I would ever have been without it, that speaking for myself, I wouldn't give it up for anything in the world. We live in this moment of these enormous breakthroughs in social acceptance, which happens to coincide with enormous medical breakthroughs that may eliminate these populations just as they arrive at acceptance. Cochlear implants are given to an increasingly large number of deaf children. The effect of the implants is to make them functionally hearing. A new compound, BMN 111, has been shown in mice to block the action of the gene that causes achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism. It's starting testing in human beings. And blood tests to establish whether a fetus has Down syndrome much earlier in a pregnancy than has been possible up until now are currently being finished so that they can be brought to market. I sometimes feel as though it's like one of those opera plots in which the hero realizes he loves the heroine just at the moment that she lies expiring on the sofa. I believe in both the social and the medical progress. I think they're both important. I think they're both urgent. But I think people in either camp sometimes fail to realize the ways in which each of them could learn from the others. And this question of cure remains a haunting one. Jim Sinclair, an adult with autism, said, "When parents say, 'I wish my child did not have autism,' what they're really saying is, 'I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different, non-autistic child again.'" Read that again. This is what we hear when you mourn over our existence. This is what we hear when you pray for a cure. That your fondest hope and dream for us is that someday we will cease to be, and strangers you can love will move in behind our faces. Autism describes a very broad range of symptoms and experiences, and there's no question that that's an extreme point of view. It's difficult to reconcile what an activist like that has said with the experience of a child sitting in the corner of a room with no language, banging his head against the wall and injuring himself. Nonetheless, that question of what should be cured or not cured haunts us. Tom and Sue Klebold are the parents of Dylan Klebold, who is one of the perpetrators of the Columbine massacre. And when I finished interviewing them the first weekend we spent together, we'd spent ages negotiating for me to come there at all. We spent a long time talking to each other. They were full of their story, and on Sunday night, exhausted, we were sitting at the kitchen table, and I said, "If Dylan were here now, is there anything that you'd want to ask him?" And his father said, "There sure is. I'd want to ask him what the hell he was doing." And Sue looked at the floor, and she thought for a minute, and then she said, "I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head." A few years later, she and I were having dinner, and she said, "When it first happened, I used to wish that I had never married. If I hadn't gone to Ohio State and hadn't crossed paths with Tom, these children wouldn't have existed, and this terrible thing wouldn't have happened. But over time, I've come to feel that I love the children I had so much that I don't want to imagine a life without them. Dylan brought me a lot of pain, but life is full of suffering, and this is mine. When I say that, I speak of my own pain and not the pain of other people." She said, "But while I recognize that it would have been better for the world if Dylan had never been born, I've concluded that it would not have been better for me." I was amazed by how often I encountered this description of people holding on to their children, and yet it seemed to me that it's actually the universal experience of parenting, which is that you have children who are flawed or difficult or just bewildering. I have yet to meet a parent who has not at some point looked at his child and said, "Where did you come from?" And while I thought it seemed extraordinary, all of these parents so attached to children who were so problematical, I thought how if some glorious angel came through my living room ceiling and offered to take away the children I have and to replace them with other, better, smarter, more attractive children, I would pray away that atrocious spectacle. The children we have become our destiny. One mother whose very severely disabled child had died through caretaker neglect said when she interred his ashes, "Let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed. Once of the child I wanted, and once of the son I loved. The differences that I'm describing individually feel very isolating. There are only so many people dealing with schizophrenia or autism or Down syndrome or criminality. There are only so many families with a child who's transgender. But if one recognizes that the experience of negotiating difference is essentially a universal experience, then one can suddenly see that the differences we have are in fact what unites us, that the experience of negotiating difference is the thing we most have in common as families. I decided to have children while I was working on this book, and many people asked me how I could have the courage to do so in the midst of examining everything that can go wrong. And I said I wasn't examining everything that can go wrong. I was examining how much love there can be even when everything goes wrong. So my husband is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. I have a daughter with one of my closest friends from college who had gotten divorced and then wanted to have a child, and mother and daughter live in Texas. And my husband and I have a son of whom I am the biological father, and our surrogate for the pregnancy was the lesbian in Minneapolis who was the mother of John's biological children. My shorthand for the arrangement is 5 parents of 4 children in 3 states. And there are people out there who somehow think that the existence of my family threatens their families, that families like mine are damaging the institution of family. But I don't accept subtractive models of love, only additive ones. And I believe that in the same way that we need species diversity to sustain the planet, so in that same sense, we need this diversity of affection and family structure to sustain the ecosphere of kindness. The day our son was born was a joyful one, and the next morning the pediatrician came in and said that he was not extending his legs correctly, and that she thought that might indicate that he had brain or neurological damage. And then she said that insofar as he was extending them, he was doing so asymmetrically, and that might reflect a mass or tumor in his brain. And she commented that his head was very large and that we should check for hydrocephalus. And I felt the whole center of my being drop out of me and spill onto the floor. And I thought, it's so unbelievably horrifying, and it's so strange to think that in the midst of writing a book about these things, I should suddenly find myself in this situation. But nature is, of course, no stranger to irony. And so we went off for hours and hours of tests and had our tiny newborn wedged into a CAT scanner and wedged into an MRI machine and had arterial blood draws and were there having a terrifying experience. And I thought to myself, my experience of this, my feelings of despair, are because this is an illness. And like all parents since the dawn of time, I want to protect my child from illness. But I also knew that if he did have any of the things we were testing for, that would be his identity. And if it was his identity, it would be my identity, and that it would be my job with my husband to build that identity into one that we were able to accept, perhaps even to celebrate. At the end of 5 hours, they said that he was really perfectly fine, and by then he was extending his legs correctly. And the pediatrician suggested that he might have had a cramp. But I thought to myself that my mother had been right, that the love you have for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. Children had ensnared me, I think, the moment I connected fatherhood with loss, but I probably wouldn't have noticed that if I hadn't been engaged in this research. Encountering so much strange love, I had fallen without even noticing it into its bewitching patterns and seen how splendor can illuminate even the most abject vulnerabilities. I had witnessed and learned the terrifying joy of unbearable responsibility. I had seen how it conquers everything else. And though sometimes I thought the parents I was interviewing were fools, enslaving themselves to a lifetime's journey with their thankless children, I realized that my research had built me a plank and that I was ready to join them on their ship. Thank you.